I stand for my people. I stand for our children's future, and I do not stand for the approval of foreign powers." With those words, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso ignited a fire across the African continent. His voice did not tremble. It carried the weight of centuries of silence, of broken promises, of aid that came wrapped in conditions more dangerous than gifts. It was not simply a speech. It was a declaration of independence in a world that has long treated Africa as a subordinate. For too long, Africans have been told they cannot stand on their own. For too long, foreign advisors have whispered that without their guidance, Africa would collapse. But what if the truth is the opposite? What if Africa has always had the strength, the ingenuity, the resilience, but it was buried under a system designed to keep it dependent? Captain Traoré's message struck at the heart of this deception. He was not begging for recognition, nor asking for permission. He was announcing that Africa will defend itself, whether the world approves or not. And isn't that the question we must all ask? Why should a sovereign continent, rich in resources, culture, and history, need permission from anyone to protect its people? For decades, Africa has been told to open its doors to aid convoys, NGOs, and international partnerships. We were told this was compassion, solidarity, friendship. But in reality, how many of these relationships were built on equality and how many were built on exploitation? When aid becomes a shield for hidden agendas, is it still aid or is it simply another mask of control? This is not just politics. This is about survival, about dignity, about whether Africa will always be treated as a field where foreign powers play their games, or whether Africans themselves will finally take the pen and write their own story. The story begins in silence, deep in the early hours of a night in the Sahel. The city of Ouagadougou was asleep, yet the desert roads whispered of movement. At precisely 2:12 a.m., an encrypted call reached Burkina Faso's Sahel Regional Command. The message was urgent. An unmarked convoy was moving under the cover of darkness. No license plates, no signals, no official records. Just a column of trucks gliding across checkpoints as if invisible. And yet, these trucks bore something unusual. Logos of European aid organizations. Logos that, in Africa, are often untouchable shields. After all, who dares to stop an aid truck delivering food to the hungry, medicine to the sick, hope to the forgotten? But Captain Traoré was no ordinary observer. He noticed what others ignored. These trucks were not following the usual aid routes. They weren't headed toward refugee camps or farming villages. Instead, they were moving along an abandoned petroleum corridor, a path long forgotten since French troops scaled back their operations in the region. Why? Why would legitimate aid trucks take a road no one uses anymore? And another question, why at night, if you are bringing hope, why hide it in darkness? Burkina Faso's military had invested in technology often dismissed as unnecessary for Africa. Infrared drones, advanced thermal cameras, AI-driven paving systems. These tools followed the convoy, and what they revealed was chilling. The manifest declared that the trucks carried grain seeds and fertilizer, essential for rebuilding farmlands destroyed by conflict. Yet the thermal scans showed steady heat signatures emanating from the cargo, heat that no grain, no fertilizer could ever produce. Something was hidden inside, something dangerous. At that moment, Traoré faced a choice. He could alert foreign partners, wait for permission, and risk the convoy disappearing forever. Or he could act as a leader of his land, without bowing to outside authority. He chose the latter. And here lies the deeper political question. Why has Africa been conditioned to believe that it must always ask others before defending itself? Why should a leader be criticized for protecting his borders? For 14 hours, Burkina Faso's drones shadowed the convoy. Every stop was logged, every path recorded. The team gathered enough data to confirm this was no ordinary movement. And yet, the more they observed, the more disturbing the picture became. The trucks behaved as if they were protected. They crossed zones where local militias operated freely, yet no one touched them. They bypassed checkpoints with casual ease, as though an invisible hand had waved them through. Who gave them this protection? Who stood behind these convoys, confident enough to move under false logos, confident enough to travel in plain sight while carrying secrets? The moment of truth came when the convoy entered Burkina Faso's sovereign territory. At exactly 6:03 a.m., Traoré issued a historic order, a complete 6-hour lockdown of the northern border. No exceptions. No civilians, no aid groups, no commercial cargo. For the first time in West African history, a nation shut down its borders without asking permission from Paris, Brussels, or New York. And the calls began pouring in, Western advisors demanding explanations, European officials warning of humanitarian disruption, United Nations representatives requesting restraint. But Traoré ignored them all. He had only one priority: the safety of his people. This was not arrogance. This was sovereignty. This was Africa saying, not today, not on our soil. The trucks thought they could move untouched. The aid logos thought they could shield lies. The foreign powers thought Africa would stay silent. But in that moment, silence was broken. Now ask yourself, if African borders had been inspected properly for decades, how many of these convoys might have been caught? How many poisons have slipped into African communities disguised as goodwill? How many children have already paid the price of this negligence? And here's the hardest question of all: was this negligence, or was it deliberate? Every revolution begins with a spark. Sometimes it is a speech, sometimes it is an injustice, and sometimes it is the quiet realization that the old rules no longer apply. For Burkina Faso, the spark came in that tense dawn when Captain Ibrahim Traoré gave the order to stop the suspicious convoy. It was not merely a military command, it was a signal to an entire continent, a signal that Africa was no longer a playground for hidden operations. That night, in military bunkers and rural villages alike, Africans asked the same burning question. If this convoy could be challenged, then what else have we been blindly accepting? For decades, African nations have bowed to the so-called international order. They were told, do not interfere, do not resist, trust the logos painted on the side of the trucks. But what if those logos were nothing but camouflage? What if the help we welcomed was in fact a chain, tightening around our sovereignty? The convoy became more than trucks on a desert road. It became a symbol of secrecy, of arrogance, of the belief that Africa would never dare to look behind the curtain. But Traoré proved them wrong. His decision was a spark that lit a fire in the hearts of millions who had long waited for a leader unafraid to say, enough. Stopping the convoy was not a reckless gamble. It was a calculated strategy that revealed how far Burkina Faso had come in its fight to reclaim sovereignty. Unlike previous leaders who hesitated, who feared the anger of foreign capitals, Traoré knew that hesitation was the deadliest weakness. He mobilized drones not just for surveillance, but for psychological pressure. Every movement of the convoy was tracked. Every route was mapped. The trucks were no longer shadows in the night. They were prey under the eyes of Africa itself. And then came the boldest move, the 6-hour border lockdown. In a world where African leaders usually wait for international approval before lifting a finger, this act was revolutionary. No consultation with Paris, no briefing to Washington, no permission slip from the United Nations. Only an order: lock it down. Do you realize the magnitude of this? For the first time, Burkina Faso declared in action, not words, that its sovereignty was not negotiable, that the nation could and would decide what crossed its borders. Is this not what every independent country is supposed to do? And yet, when Africa does it, suddenly it is called provocative, reckless, even dangerous. Why? Because the truth terrifies those who have grown comfortable treating Africa as open land. They expect silence. They expect submission. They expect leaders to tremble at the thought of cutting off aid convoys. But Traoré turned that expectation into ashes. The strategy was not only military, it was psychological warfare against decades of dependency. By refusing to bow, he forced the world to see an Africa capable of standing alone. And the question exploded across the continent. If Burkina Faso can do this, why not us? When the trucks were finally intercepted, the truth spilled out like poison. The manifest had promised seeds and fertilizer. Boxes labeled as agricultural development aid were stacked neatly for inspection. At first glance, everything seemed legitimate, but legitimacy, as Africa has learned, can be a mask. Soldiers pried open the first container. Instead of seeds, they found metallic cylinders sealed in protective casings. Thermal scanners confirmed what suspicions had whispered all along. These were not tools of farming, but tools of destruction. Some containers held sophisticated communication devices, encrypted radios, military-grade drones, surveillance equipment capable of mapping entire villages. Others contained chemical agents disguised under false agricultural codes, substances with the potential to contaminate water supplies or weaken crops. And hidden in the deepest corners, small arms, ammunition, tactical vests, all packed under the cover of humanitarian logos. So tell me, was this truly aid, or was it sabotage? The soldiers who witnessed the discovery did not cheer. They were shaken. For how many years had such convoys crossed their lands without being stopped? How many times had Africa unknowingly welcomed the very tools used to destabilize it? This was no accident. No bureaucratic error. This was deliberate infiltration. And yet, when news of the discovery leaked, what was the global reaction? Silence, denial, deflection. Some foreign officials accused Burkina Faso of exaggeration. Others warned of misinterpretation. But none could answer the central question. Why were weapons and toxic materials hidden under the banner of humanitarian aid? The discovery shattered illusions. It exposed a system where charity can be weaponized, where partnerships can mask plots, where Africans are expected to accept foreign cargo without question. But Traoré refused to accept. He ripped the mask away for the world to see. This was not just about a convoy. It was about the future of Africa. If one convoy could carry hidden death, how many more are out there? If one leader could expose it, how many others must rise before the pattern is broken? The spark had become a fire. The strategy had proven that sovereignty could be defended. And the discovery had revealed the scale of betrayal. So I ask you, how long will Africa be treated as a testing ground for foreign agendas? How long will our children drink from poison wells disguised as gifts? How long before every nation on this continent decides, like Burkina Faso, to say, not on our soil, not anymore? The convoy was not an isolated incident. It was a thread in a much larger web, a web woven with secrecy, deceit, and the arrogance of powers who believe Africa will never open its eyes. For decades, aid convoys, development projects, and humanitarian missions have rolled across African borders without inspection. Each time, the people were told to be grateful, to bow their heads, to accept the gift without question. But what if those gifts were poisoned? What if behind every smiling handshake was a knife hidden in the other hand? This is the reality. Africa faces a carefully constructed web of deception, from foreign NGOs with suspicious funding to research missions that mysteriously appear near mineral-rich regions, to convoys carrying more than just fertilizer. The pattern is clear. Africa is not being helped. Africa is being watched, manipulated, and controlled. And let us ask, why is transparency demanded from African governments, but secrecy tolerated from foreign actors? Why are our budgets audited, our elections questioned, our policies dictated, yet no one dares to audit the cargo that rolls across our soil in the dead of night? Why are Africans told to trust blindly while the rest of the world hides its true hand? This is not partnership. This is exploitation, disguised with a smile. And every time we fail to question, the web tightens. The decision to stop the convoy was not just about blocking weapons. It was about declaring war on secrecy itself. For too long, Africa has lived in the shadows of hidden deals and silent betrayals. But what happens when one nation demands light? What happens when leaders declare, no more secrets on African soil? Burkina Faso chose transparency over secrecy. Soldiers filmed the inspection. Reports were made public. Ordinary citizens could see with their own eyes what had been hidden from them. And suddenly, a simple act of opening boxes became a revolutionary act of governance. Think about it. How many African leaders before Traoré would have dared to expose such a discovery? How many would have quietly returned the trucks, issued an apology, and pretended nothing happened, just to preserve foreign approval? Transparency is dangerous, not because it destabilizes Africa, but because it destabilizes those who benefit from our silence. When the truth is laid bare, narratives collapse. When the people see what has been done in their name, anger rises. And anger, when united, becomes a force no foreign power can control. So the question is this: are African nations ready to embrace transparency even when it exposes uncomfortable truths? Are they ready to show their people not just what is happening abroad, but what is happening in their own corridors of power? If not now, when the discovery in Burkina Faso sparked something larger than national pride, it awakened the spirit of continental solidarity. Across West Africa, people spoke the same words: if they can deceive Burkina Faso, they can deceive us too. Suddenly, Mali, Niger, Ghana, and even distant states began to reconsider the unchecked flow of foreign aid and military cargo across their borders. And here lies the true danger for those who profit from secrecy unity, because as long as Africa is divided, the web of deception works. One country protests, another stays silent. One leader resists, another signs the deal. But when the fire spreads, when nations realize that their struggles are not isolated but shared, the balance of power begins to shift. Imagine a continent where no convoy crosses without inspection. Imagine an Africa where solidarity replaces suspicion, where governments cooperate not out of fear, but out of a shared determination to protect sovereignty. What then would become of the hidden hands that seek to manipulate us? Already, we see the seeds of this solidarity. Joint military exercises between African nations, new economic alliances that bypass old colonial roots, leaders daring to speak not just for their nations, but for Africa as a whole. Burkina Faso may have lit the flame, but the fire now belongs to all of us. But solidarity is not automatic. It requires courage. It requires leaders willing to risk sanctions, media attacks, even assassination attempts for the sake of truth. It requires citizens who refuse to be divided by propaganda, who stand shoulder to shoulder regardless of language, tribe, or border. The question then is clear: will Africa choose solidarity, or will we allow ourselves to be trapped in the old game of divide and rule? Will we rise together or fall separately? The web of deception has been exposed. Transparency has shown us the power of light, and continental solidarity is the path forward. But none of this is guaranteed. Every nation must choose submission or sovereignty, silence or truth, division or unity. Burkina Faso made its choice. Now the eyes of the continent are watching. So I ask you, how many more convoys must be stopped before Africa finally wakes up? How many more lies must be exposed before we refuse to be deceived again? And how long will it take for the world to realize that Africa is not a pawn in their game, but a player in its own right? The fire has been lit. The question is, will the rest of Africa keep it burning? Amid speeches filled with fire, amid the sound of marching boots and banners waving in the wind, one truth remains undeniable. It is the ordinary people who pay the highest price. The farmers in forgotten border villages, the mothers waiting for their sons to come home, the children who have learned to sleep through the roar of engines and the distant sound of gunfire. They are the ones caught in the middle of political games. For years, convoys labeled as aid rolled past their homes. People were told not to ask questions. They were told this was help, this was support, this was humanitarian. But was it the day that a suspicious convoy was stopped, the veil was torn apart? A farmer in the Sahel said words that cut sharper than any sword. We do not need hidden weapons inside aid trucks. We need water, we need seeds, we need schools, for our children. That single sentence exposed the hypocrisy of an entire system. Behind every box of ammunition hidden under the banner of humanitarian relief, behind every rifle smuggled inside a container marked medical supplies, lies the blood of future victims. Who will take responsibility when those weapons are used against innocent villagers who will stand before grieving mothers, before orphans left behind, and explain that this was just a mistake in shipment? This is the human side of the story, the side that powerful actors want us to forget. Nobody rejects real aid, but people have the right to know what is inside those convoys. Where is it going? Who does it truly serve? Every lie, no matter how small, carries a price far too heavy, the price of human life. When Burkina Faso revealed the truth, the world expected silence. But what came next was unexpected Operation Sahara Sands. This was not just a military maneuver, it was a political statement, a thunderous declaration to the entire globe. We will no longer be blind. Operation Sahara Sands rested on three pillars, blocking every secret flow, controlling borders with African forces, and exposing every link in the deceptive aid networks. Picture it in the vastness of the Sahara Desert, once dismissed as ungovernable territory. New checkpoints rise. Drones patrol the skies, not foreign drones, but African-operated eyes in the sky. Joint patrols form between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. What was once a power vacuum becomes a shield for the continent. But more than tactics, Sahara Sands was a strike against an old colonial mindset, the idea that Africa cannot protect itself, that Africa must forever depend on outsiders. When those containers were opened under the watchful eye of television cameras, when the evidence was displayed for all to see, the question thundered across the globe: who is really fueling instability in Africa? And another question followed: if Burkina Faso, a small nation with limited resources, could take such a stand, why can't larger, richer, stronger African nations do the same? Why accept silence? Why turn away when suspicious convoys cross their lands? Operation Sahara Sands became more than a security plan. It became a test of will, a test of dignity, a test of sovereignty. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. First, consciousness shifted. People began to demand transparency. Youth movements across the continent asked the same haunting question: if Burkina Faso could, why not us? Social media erupted with hashtags declaring, "Sovereignty is not negotiable." Demonstrations sparked in capitals. The voices of the young and restless refused to be ignored. Politically, the ripple spread. Some governments were forced to review every so-called aid agreement. Parliaments debated contracts that had once been signed behind closed doors. Leaders were cornered into admitting blind trust was no longer possible. Inspect first, trust later became the new doctrine. Regionally, the seeds of solidarity were sown. It was not yet a continental revolution, but for the first time in decades, the notion of African self-determination felt alive. No longer just a slogan in dusty documents, but a living reality broadcast live for millions to witness. And perhaps the most important change was psychological. People began to look at their situation with sharper eyes. Africa is not poor because it lacks resources. Africa is poor because it is trapped in a web of dependency, of manipulation, of secrecy. To break free requires boldness, sometimes even recklessness. Burkina Faso chose boldness. Burkina Faso chose risk, and in doing so it ignited a spark. But will that spark become a lasting fire? That is the real question. Will Operation Sahara Sands be remembered as a symbolic moment, a brief flare of defiance, or will it be the dawn of a new era? Because history is unforgiving. If the momentum dies, the old order will tighten its grip once more. But if the momentum lives, if other nations join the call, then this chapter may be remembered as the moment Africa finally refused to be deceived. One thing is certain: once truth has been exposed, it cannot be hidden again. Once the people have seen, they will never again accept the darkness. And once one nation dares to rise, others will be forced to listen to the same call. For far too long, the story of Africa has been told by others. Written in boardrooms thousands of miles away, shaped by lenses that see only poverty, corruption, and chaos, while ignoring resilience, brilliance, and dignity. But today, the winds are shifting. A new African narrative is being born, not whispered in the corridors of foreign embassies, but shouted from the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, and beyond. This is no longer the Africa that waits patiently for approval, no longer the Africa that accepts aid laced with hidden agendas, no longer the Africa that bows its head while outsiders define its destiny. This is the Africa that dares to ask, why should sovereignty be a privilege and not a right? Why should freedom come with conditions, signed in fine print? Why should we remain silent while others dictate the rhythm of our future? The new narrative begins with courage. Courage to expose lies disguised as help. Courage to stop convoys that roll across our deserts with secrets buried under boxes. Courage to look the world in the eye and say, we will not be deceived. Burkina Faso has taken this step, but the story does not end there. One spark is not enough. It takes many flames to light a fire that cannot be extinguished. The new narrative is also about unity. For decades, Africa has been told, you are too divided, too weak, too fragmented. But who benefits from that lie? Who gains when Africans believe they cannot trust each other? The truth is this: when nations stand alone, they stumble. But when they lock arms, they rise. The convoys that once carried deception across borders now face a different reality, borders guarded by solidarity. The Sahara, once a highway of manipulation, is slowly turning into a shield of cooperation. And yet, the greatest change is not in politics or security, it is in the minds of the people. Young Africans are refusing the old narrative. They are no longer satisfied with slogans of independence written in history books. They want independence they can feel, independence that feeds them, protects them, and inspires them. They are asking uncomfortable questions. Why are our resources exported raw while our people remain unemployed? Why do we sign contracts that enrich others while our hospitals remain empty? Why do we keep believing in promises that never arrive? This is the power of the new African narrative. It forces the entire continent to look in the mirror. It demands that leaders choose. Will you continue the path of dependency, or will you walk the harder, riskier road of self-determination? History is watching. The world is watching. But most importantly, the people are watching. And once people see the truth, they cannot unsee it. Once they taste the idea of real sovereignty, they cannot return to silence. The new African narrative is not perfect. It will face resistance. It will be challenged by powerful interests. It will be attacked by those who profit from the old system. But every movement in history has begun this way, with a spark, with a stand, with a refusal to bow. And so, the question now is not whether Africa can write a new story. The question is, will Africa dare to finish it? Will its leaders have the strength to choose dignity over comfort? Will its people demand accountability from those who speak in their name? Will this continent finally rise, not as a collection of victims, but as a community of nations that know their worth? A new chapter is waiting to be written. A chapter where Africa is not defined by what others give or take, but by what Africa decides for itself. A chapter where sovereignty is sacred, transparency is non-negotiable, and solidarity is unbreakable. The world may resist this story, but it cannot stop it. Because once Africa decides to rise, no force on earth can hold it down. This is not just a dream. It is already happening. And the next line of this narrative will be written not in foreign capitals, but right here, by Africans themselves.